Hello everyone, today I have for us a very interesting game by Judit Polgar against Viswanathan Anand from the 1998. Judit Polgar was, of course, is the best female player of all time, and here she's playing against one of the best chess players of all time, Anand, and they had many matches with both sides scoring many victories, but Polgar was having issues with Anand in the 90s, and this was the first of the two wins in a row for her in the late 90s, and both were interesting and great games that she went over in her books published for Quality Chess in the 2010s. And this is from the second book called From GM to Top 10. And both games against Anand are great. This one is pretty nice from the standpoint of the positional chess, so we shall see how it went. Let's go. It's going to be a nice analysis both by me and by Judit. Alright, so it was a Sicilian, and very normal and everyday kind of variation. This kind of Najdorf is still seen at the top level, but here we have a little bit of a strange move, maybe a little bit of a rare move, better to say, and that's going back on f3 with the knight instead of going knight b3. So this is the first time that we can see kind of a choice for Judit. She didn't want to go into some kind of complicated lines, but instead decided to go for this weak d6 and maybe an outpost on d5. Okay, bishop e7, bishop c4, castles, bishop e6. There are several moves here possible. Bishop b3 is very common, but she plays queen e2, b5, and bishop b3. Here is the first moment where something substantial happens, and that's bishop takes b3. This move, Polgar writes very much about this move and says that this is the start of the issues for black, mainly as this move undefends d5. So not only that, but after AB, which happened in the game, White developed the rook without moving it from the starting square. So now this rook became active out of nowhere, right? And b5 also is now hanging, right? So knight b5 is a possibility in the position, and we shall see that this move bishop takes b3 is very important later on because it was a strong defender of the square d5. So the full game after this will be around kind of thinking about d5 and circling around the square d5 as an outpost for the knight is perfect there. Instead, maybe a move like h6 made a lot of sense. So we shall see then. Okay, knight bd7, stopping knight b5, rook fd1, and here queen c7, pretty strong move. Of course, it's a normal developing move. One could say as the bishop g5 followed, and then at some point bishop would take on f6 and get rid of another defender of d5. One could say maybe instead of queen c7, h6 would be better, but this weakens more squares, and knight h4 becomes strong. And maybe with knight f5 being the intention and d6 being the weakness. Of course, g6 is not possible because h6 hangs. So, for example, if the line b4 trying to take advantage of the e4 being weak, knight a4, knight takes e4, knight f5, and now one could see here that kind of too many problems for black already appear. b6 is weak, d6 is weak, e4 is very weak, as the knight could get taken. For example, bishop h6 is a threat. So this would lead to some kind of danger. I calculated, for example, knight back to f6, bishop h6, gf, and queen e3 already. gh6 and queen e3 already threatening checkmate on h6. So yeah, the position definitely looks very scary, and the engine also doesn't like it too much for for black. So instead of h6, b4 is very straightforward, but now the problem is the a6 pawn. So after knight moves to d5, we could get knight to e4, but after rook a6, white is not material down, and b4 is very weak. But okay, so queen c7 was played, correct move, but bishop g5, rook fc8, and now the threat is to win c2. Now I would like you to stop the video for the first time here and think what should white play in this case. Alright, the move that is the correct one is knight e1. This move is kind of like killing two birds with one stone. First of all, it's preparing to start the knight route to better squares, such as d5, and it's also defending the pawn on c2. It will be very important to see that this knight could eventually later on go to d5 via the route g2, e3. Again, b4 was a possibility here, but after bishop f6, and for example knight f6, knight d5, and rook d5, and for example a5, because the pawn is hanging, some g3, h4, and then knight to e3 would lead to pretty much very similar position to what happened in the game. Of course, to mention here, bishop takes f6 is a mistake. Of course, you're allowing knight d5, and the knight is a very strong piece there. And also to remind that if the queen went, for example, to b7, d6 would hang already. So yeah, we need to be careful not to lose to some tactic. So we had queen b7, okay, bishop f6, knight f6, knight d5, knight d5, and this is the first important moment, and that's never to take on the square that you want an outpost for your knight with the pawn, because the pawn can't move, so the rook has to move. Rook can move while the pawn is immobile there. So here Polgar says white has a slightly better version of the position from the previous note. That was the one with b4. There is no pressure against the c2 pawn, and black does not have the same space advantage as on the queen side, so as in the position with b4, c5, b4, a5 that would happen in the previous variation. Here Anand tries with rook c5, and of course the worst placed piece gets into the action, rook d1, rook d5, rook d5, rook c8, c3, I think useful move. And here Anand makes another slight inaccuracy, and that was to play b4. And after b4, c4 is a correct move, and here it is kind of already starting to seem that only one side can play for a victory, and that's white, because black doesn't have any way to create counterplay, and we shall see here that black's play for the next 20-30 moves will be very much shuffling, while white tries to improve the position and win. g6, okay, g3, rook c5, and not taking here. When I was analyzing this on my own, I was kind of curious to take on what happens if we take on c5 and then plant the knight on d5, but the variation that I came up with was rook c5, dc5, knight g2, and for example the queen trying to get to d4, the black queen trying to get to d4, so this queen gets maybe to d4. So queen c6, queen c2, as we can't play knight e3 right away because that hangs the pawn on e4, queen d6, knight e3, and queen d4, knight d5. And now it seems that this queen is controlling the position just enough for the position to be held. So Judit makes correct move, and she plays rook d1, keeping the rook on the board, and we shall see that this rook becomes very useful later on with some kingside attack that will happen as well. So a5, okay, maybe the idea of a4 becomes kind of there in the air, but it was not something important. I think it didn't happen, didn't change much in the game. Maybe he did it also to have queen a6 as a possibility, I don't know. It seems like just the usual move. Knight c2, king g7, and queen d3. Of course, the point is that, again, we can't play knight e3 here because e4 would hang. So queen d3, rook c6, knight e3, white is going to the square, d5, queen c8, king g2. There is no rush with knight for knight d5 because some queen h3 could happen and be a little bit annoying, so king g2 definitely makes sense, queen e6. And here we have another moment where we have to stop and think. The possibility of queen d5 happens to be very interesting here, but let's see if it is good or not. So think about queen d5 and the position that will happen after queen d5. So she played queen e2, but queen d5 is a very interesting move. However, I would say it's interesting, not good. Interesting move, as for example, rook c5 is met by queen b7 and then knight d5 with the queen being active on b7. But in case of queen d5, this seems very logical now to take with the c pawn. However, if we take with the c pawn and we plan the knight to c4, then there is this move a4, and the knight is not that happy there at all, and maybe black is even okay here. So we can't take ba because the rook c4 move is there. Instead, rook a1 and then knight c4 would be possible, but with counterplay as well, and we can't move this knight before we get the king to d2, and I think maybe the position is holdable even here. So just in case, yeah, this is not obvious, knight d6, rook c2, and a lot of problems happen for white here. So this was interesting. However, if we are to take here with the knight, our position is obviously still clearly better, but I think she kept the queens on the board, so she has more attacking chances on the king side. So bishop d8 happened, okay. Prophylactic move. There is nothing that black can do that is going to change the dynamics of the position. Bishop b6 definitely makes sense, but it's not going to happen. Knight d5, and now important is, for example, in this case, bishop b6 being played would lead to a weakness of d6 that is even worse. So we can now take, actually, this is possible. And now, for example, rook d5 attacking a5, you must play rook a6 and queen d3. And now with the pieces being completely tied up, white is going to have like walk in the park here. Interestingly enough, c5 here is not that good because dc, the queen is defending a6, so you have to be careful of this kind of tactics still. But yeah, queen d3, and black's position is pretty much hopeless. We are playing on one goal here, and we just need to be careful how to improve the position, while black is completely busted here and completely paralyzed. So rook c5 happened instead of bishop b6, queen e3, getting the queen to an active square. Okay, it's a logical move as well. Bishop e7 and rook d3. Okay, a little bit of shuffling here. Yeah, Judith as well. Judith said she didn't know exactly what to do in this position, so she was trying to find a plan, and she finally found a plan with going to attack on the king side. And here Anand made a mistake by king g7. He's a little bit maybe playing this position too passively, and instead of this, h5 I think was necessary. And then yeah, the king side attack has been stopped, and maybe there is a better chance to hold this. Instead, king g7 happened, allowing h5, bishop g5. Okay, bishop got to a good square, but it's not going to stay there for long. Queen f3, rook c8, rook d1, getting to the h file. That's why I said some time ago that this rook got to a useful square. Rook c6, queen e2, rook c8, so black doesn't know what to do. Rook h1, king g8, another waiting move, and f3. Very important move, because this move makes also queen f2 possible to get the queen to this good diagonal, but also queen g1, queen h2 is possible now. So rook b8, queen f2, rook b7, not allowing queen a7 jump, and now hg. This is a good move, correct move, and Anand responds with the correct move. fg. However, white's position is much better. Just to mention, ag would lead to this queen getting to h2 and problems for black. I can just see here that there are some mating attacks. For example, queen g1, f5, trying to play a bit active and maybe, you know, getting more defense of the 7th rank. Queen h2, bishop f6, queen h6. Now g6 is hanging, and if in the case of bishop g7, queen g5, and yeah, it seems that everything is kind of holding together, but yeah, with many weaknesses. Queen d8 is a threat. Queen d8 is a threat here. There are at least several more threats. So for example, if we try to stop that threat, let's say bishop f8, then we can go check, and yeah, this is going to win. Yeah, we have knight h5 and we are going to win the piece here. Okay, so fg is stopping. Okay, maybe you can train from the position. In the case of hg, there are definitely other interesting attacking possibilities here, and I can't go over all of them. So fg, and now another good move by Polgar. She made many good moves in the position. That's c5. So here we have the principle of two weaknesses. The first weakness is going to be the king, and the second weakness is that this bishop is not really useful. So the knight is better than the bishop. So that's kind of the two weaknesses. And with c5, she opens the position and makes use of the bad king here. D c5, queen c5. Okay, a5 is hanging, so bishop d8 makes sense. Rook c1. Getting the, maybe in mind here is queen c6, maybe queen c8 is a possibility as well. She writes about these possibilities in the book. I'm not going to go over every line that she does in the book. You should read the book definitely for this, but instead decides to sidestep and now prepares the infiltration in another way. So she would place the kind of the Alekhine gun, but in this case with one rook, place the rook in front of the queen so that the rook can go to c6 or c8 with the queen defending and not trade the queens instead. King g7, again, black doesn't have much to do. Rook c4 and rook d7, interesting move here for black with some ideas maybe to give up an exchange at some point here. And in case that white is not careful, this can happen and this could lead to some kind of draw with perpetual checks. Queen c1, h5. Okay, rook c6 and rook d6. Rook c8, we're not trading, of course we're not gaining anything by trading, so rook c8 makes sense. And now this rook can maybe go to a8 and then a7, where it's going to control the full 7th rank. Queen d7 and queen c5. Just to mention here, rook b8 would be premature, even though we have the plan of queen c8 now and controlling the position completely. There is rook c6. And I again stop the video and see why the move rook d8 doesn't win the game for us, as it seems that it wins. So why is rook d8 failing? Question. Alright, so if you found rook d8, queen d5, rook d5, rook c1, rook e5 and rook c2, good job. This is leading to a position where black has a lot of interesting counterplay. Maybe even black is not even at all better, at all worse, but the e-pawn is a little bit annoying here. So the point is, rook c6, rook d8, seems that after rook c1, rook d7, we're just a piece, but there is this queen d5, beautiful move, and you just don't have anything better than to take either with the pawn or with the rook, but you're not getting anything. All right, so queen c5 happened, and here the move that I was mentioning as a nice tricky move is bishop b6. Now, as the rook went to d6, now this is possible. And for example, after knight b6, which would be an inaccuracy, rook d2 and perpetual check, as we can't hide as we get mated, right? So here we have to keep the king on g2 and g1. For example, if we went to any other square, we would get mated, right? So we have to be careful that we have this h3 square for us as well. So in case of queen c4, then bishop can go back to d8, and we didn't gain much in the position. Of course, there are some chances here for white still, but for example, after rook b8, we can again go to b6, as the queen can again give perpetual itself. So for example, rook b6, knight b6, and queen d2, and the queen alone is strong enough to give perpetual check here, and we can't really hide, as if we try to hide, we will allow something like this. And now again, the king is very weak, and with losing the f3 pawn and g3 pawn, again, we can't hide, and the knight is hanging, so we will either lose the knight or allow perpetual, which is not good. Neither of these are good options for us. Alright, so king h6 happened, and here Judit had great move rook a8, with king h6 being a bad move, because now after bishop b6 there is queen c1 inclusion, and this is very important. So this would lead to no tactics and infiltration of the queen to g5. For example, if king g7, queen g5, and e5 is hanging, we are threatening knight b6 as well. So for example, if you go rook e6, I can start with knight b6, and after rook takes, queen e5, and yeah, this is just lost. There are some checkmate ideas all around the board here, and of course it's not going to last very much. This position for black, important to mention is, I would say that even here playing queen d5 should win, but as there are no perpetual checks, as this is just one check, and when we hide we can just play rook h8 here with the threat of rook h7, and this is just incredibly strong, and there is nothing we can do. For example, check, back, check, and g4, and this is resigns now, as we can't stop mate. Yeah, just for example to mention one checkmate. Yeah, and there are many ways to checkmate. Right, so in the case here of g5, there is rook h8, and then you lose the h5. I didn't forget about this, so, or the g5 pawn if you try to go king g6. Right, so rook b8 was played by Judit. She missed an opportunity. Bishop f6, queen e3, getting the queen now to the weak diagonal, and here king g7 would prolong the game, and there would be still chances for black. Rook e8 and trying to get to a7 is possible, but for example, after queen c6, rook a7, rook d6, there is queen b6. Some tactics here, and we would win the position. In the case of queen b5, knight c7, and then knight e8 is looking again very strong. So yeah, it seems, maybe this is an interesting variation. Maybe I can spend a little bit more time on this, because rook d3 seems logical, but after we get this rook is pinned, right? So we have to be careful with it, and the queen is attacked as well. So yeah, queen d7 is the only move. And after knight d5, seems that there is rook b3 and white lost a pawn, but this rook is incredibly misplaced, and it can also get trapped. So this is definitely not the way to play it. And we are getting the material back as well. And now we can think about rook a7 as well as a placement of the rook to the best square. So bishop g5 was played, and this is a game losing move. And here I would like you to stop the video and maybe even put this position on the board and try to solve it, as this is very nice and very interesting tactic, and you should take your time for this one. So don't just stop the video, guess for 5 seconds, and then if you can't find a solution, then you're unhappy and you say, okay, David, show me. I hope you found the solution. This is incredibly beautiful. It's f4, very logical move, but the point is after ef we are not going to go gf, which is not going to win, but instead rook h8. We're including the check, okay, but after king g7, queen d4, bishop f6, it seems that everything is holding, but we have queen f6, rook f6 and rook h7, and here Anand actually resigned a couple of moves earlier, but here is the proper time to resign, as we are just going to be down a piece and we will lose the game. So this is a mix of great strategy and great tactics for Polgar. I am pretty sure you learned a thing or two, but maybe the most important takeaway from here is when you have a position where d5 is weak, take good care of it, because you've seen what happens here. The knight on d5 was a monster, so bishop b3 was the start of the issues. And then, interestingly enough, not just the knight on c3, but both knights on c3 and f3 ended up on the square at some point. So a little bit of pattern training as well for you. I hope you had a good time with this analysis and that you learned some things. Definitely check out Quality Chess 3 books from Judit Polgar. There are also some courses on Chessable by her, but I didn't go over those, so I'm not sure the quality, and I'm pretty sure the quality is good, but I'm not sure who are the courses appropriate for. So these 3 books are definitely good. I've read parts of all 3. I've read the full second book, as I think it's just incredible, and there are many interesting games by her against Karpov, Kasparov, Korchnoi, Anand, and all the other masters of that time and world champions. Thank you for watching and see you soon.